It all began with a phone call I never expected. My neighbor's voice on the line was trembling, almost as if she didn't want to be the one delivering the news. She said, "You'd better come back soon. The HOA has declared your house abandoned." Abandoned? The word cut through me like a knife. My home, the one I worked for, the one I kept spotless, the one filled with memories, abandoned? I wasn't even gone that long, just a few weeks away on business. But in those short weeks, the very people I paid fees to every month, the very board I trusted to maintain the community, had taken upon themselves to declare my property empty and neglected. When I first heard it, I thought it was a mistake. Surely a clerical error. But then came the photographs. HOA officials had circulated images of my house with captions like "Notice of Vacancy" and * "Property in Abandonment." They even placed an official notice on my door with a bright orange sticker, one that screamed for all my neighbors to see. "Vacant. HOA action pending." That's when the shock turned into rage. Because I knew something they didn't. My security system was running the entire time. Every corner of my house was under surveillance, inside and out, and the footage would soon reveal what was really happening. But before I show you what the cameras caught, let me ask you something. If you came home after weeks away and found your HOA declaring your house abandoned, what would you do? Would you stay silent, or would you fight back? Asterisk. Because what I discovered on those recordings wasn't just negligence. It was something far darker, something that made my stomach turn the moment I hit play. Let me take you back to the weeks leading up to this chaos. I had left town for a crucial project, something I couldn't postpone. Before leaving, I made sure everything in the house was secured. The grass was trimmed, the hedges clipped, and I even left timers on my indoor lights to switch on at night, so it looked occupied. My neighbor across the street, Mrs. Alvarez, agreed to collect any mail or packages that might arrive. In short, there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that should have suggested my home was abandoned. But HOA board members had been circling like vultures. According to my neighbor, they began whispering within days of my departure. They complained about a single piece of trash blown into my yard. They grumbled about a couple of leaves in the driveway. Petty things. Things any normal neighbor would overlook. Instead, the HOA documented every detail with photos, acting like investigators gathering evidence. It wasn't enough for them to maintain order. They wanted control. They wanted to establish dominance, to remind every homeowner who really ran the neighborhood. And apparently, I had become their latest target. The day they posted the abandoned notice was the day the entire neighborhood started buzzing. Imagine driving home after work and seeing your neighbor's house plastered with a bright orange sticker declaring it empty. It was humiliating, a public shaming tactic meant to isolate me from the community. But what they didn't realize was that my cameras never sleep. I hadn't checked the feed while I was away. Work kept me too busy. But once I heard what happened, I logged into the system immediately. And what I saw chilled me to the bone. Because the so-called evidence they were collecting wasn't just passive observation. They weren't just taking notes or photos. They were stepping onto my property. They were walking up my driveway, peeking through my windows, and in some cases, trying my doorknob as if testing whether they could get inside. The audacity of it left me speechless. My home wasn't abandoned. It was being violated. And worse, on one of the recordings, I spotted the HOA president herself, Karen Douglas, standing in front of my house with her clipboard, wagging her finger in the air as she lectured another board member. She was pointing directly at my front door, her voice raised in visible anger, as though my property were a personal offense to her. This wasn't about maintenance. This was about power. And Karen, with her fiery temper and sharp tongue, wanted to make an example out of me. I leaned closer to the screen, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Karen wasn't just pointing. She was holding papers. Papers that looked suspiciously like property reassignment forms. Could it be that while I was away, they were preparing to move towards seizing control of my house? The thought sent a wave of fury through me. My absence was a neglect. It wasn't abandonment. It was simply a business trip. Yet in those weeks, the HOA had spun a false narrative, and now the entire neighborhood was buying into their lies. As I sat there replaying the footage, Another clip popped up. This time, it was taken at night. Two shadows moved across my lawn, whispering to each other as they shined flashlights toward my windows. These weren't random trespassers. I recognized them instantly. They were HOA enforcement volunteers. That's when I realized this wasn't just Karen's obsession. It was an organized effort. They weren't just labeling my home abandoned. They were preparing for something bigger. Something that could end with me losing my property altogether. And the only thing standing between me and their scheme was the footage my cameras had recorded. But exposing them wouldn't be easy, because Karen wasn't the type of person to back down when confronted. If I made this footage public, I knew it would ignite a battle bigger than anything the neighborhood had ever seen. And I was ready for it, because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every homeowner who had ever been bullied, shamed, or intimidated by an HOA that thought it had absolute power. This was about standing up to Karen and showing the entire neighborhood the truth. But how far was she willing to go to silence me before I revealed what I knew? The moment I discovered the footage of Karen and her committee prowling around my house, I realized the situation was no longer just an HOA technicality. It was a full-blown conspiracy. What they wanted wasn't compliance. They wanted control. And if I didn't act fast, my home, my privacy, and my dignity could be stripped away piece by piece under the guise of community enforcement. But here's the chilling part. The deeper I dug into the recordings, the more sinister it all became. It wasn't just one or two visits. There were multiple instances, day after day, where HOA members trespassed onto my property. They weren't subtle either. Some strolled casually across the lawn. Others marched up the driveway with clipboards, pointing at details like cracks in the concrete or tiny weeds in the flower bed, acting as though they were surveying a condemned building. The audacity burned in me. These people weren't protecting the community. They were rewriting reality. They wanted everyone to believe I had abandoned my house, and they were willing to fabricate evidence to make it seem true. And here's the hook that might make your heart race. What if your own neighbors, the very people entrusted to manage your community, began plotting to strip you of your home? Would you stay quiet and hope it blew over? Or would you fight tooth and nail to protect everything you owned? Asterisk, asterisk. That question haunted me as I continued reviewing the footage, because every second revealed something more disturbing. One video, taken in broad daylight, showed Karen herself standing with 3 other board members directly on my porch. She was holding a large stack of papers, gesturing furiously as she slapped the pages against her clipboard. Behind her, another member peeled off a bright orange sticker identical to the one that had been plastered on my door. They were preparing more notices, as to declare my house a lost cause was already a done deal. But it was what happened next that made my stomach churn. Karen leaned in close to the door, pressing her face against a glass pane as if trying to peer inside. She shielded the glare with her hands, squinting to see whether the house truly was empty. To any rational person, it was clear. She wasn't checking for maintenance issues. She was snooping, desperate to confirm her narrative of abandonment. Worse still, later footage at night revealed a figure I hadn't noticed at first. A man dressed in dark clothing, flashlight in hand, creeping along the side of my house. When the light caught his face, I froze. It was the HOA's so-called enforcement volunteer, someone Karen had vouched for at every board meeting. There he was, sneaking around my yard like a thief in the night, testing windows, rattling handles, and shining his light into every corner. I realized then that this wasn't just harassment. This was a calculated move to set me up, to paint the picture that my property was abandoned, vulnerable, and unoccupied, so they could justify taking further action. And what action was that? The papers Karen carried told the story. Upon closer inspection of the footage, I saw the header printed clearly across the top. Petition for property reassignment. My blood ran cold. They weren't just threatening me with fines. They were laying the groundwork to seize authority over my home under the pretense of abandonment. How could they possibly justify that? Simple. If they convinced enough neighbors that my property was empty, they could push through emergency measures to appoint a caretaker or even lease it under HOA authority. It had happened in other neighborhoods. Whispers of it floated around community forums. But now it was happening right here, to me. The neighborhood, once quiet and friendly, was shifting into something darker. Cars slowed as they passed my house. Neighbors whispered behind hedges. And people began avoiding eye contact when walking their dogs. The orange sticker had done its job. It branded me, marked my property like a scarlet letter. But the cameras told the real story. And I knew what I had to do. I gathered every clip, every timestamp, every still image. Trespassing, illegal entry attempts, false notices, harassment, together. They painted a damning picture of an HOA gone rogue, led by a president who treated homeowners like pawns in her personal game of power. Yet even as I compiled the evidence, a question gnawed at me. Would exposing them be enough, or would it make me a bigger target? Karen wasn't someone who backed down easily. Her reputation for aggression was legendary. Neighbors had told stories of her screaming matches at board meetings, her obsessive monitoring of lawns, her habit of storming up the doors and demanding compliance on the spot. If I went public with this footage, I wouldn't just be challenging her authority. I would be declaring war. And war was exactly what she wanted. Because while I was gathering my evidence, Karen was already escalating. The footage revealed her latest move. During one visit, she wasn't alone. This time, she brought along a local contractor. Together, they walked the perimeter of my property, pointing and jotting down notes, as though preparing estimates. Estimates for what? Repairs? Renovations? Or perhaps demolition? The contractor gestured toward the roof, then scribbled something down. Karen nodded approvingly. That's when I realized they weren't just talking about abandonment. They were already treating my house as if it belonged to them. That single realization lit a fire in me. They could whisper, they could trespass, they could smear my name across the neighborhood. But they would not take my home. Not while I had proof. Not while my cameras had captured every illegal move. But how I chose to use that footage could mean the difference between victory and disaster. Should I release it to the neighborhood immediately, exposing Karen for the manipulative tyrant she was? Or should I take it directly to law enforcement, building a legal case that couldn't be ignored? The choice weighed on me heavily. Because I knew one thing for certain. Karen would retaliate the moment she realized I had evidence. And judging by her escalating behavior, her retaliation wouldn't be subtle. The neighborhood was about to become a battlefield, and I was caught right in the center. The board thought they had me cornered. Karen paraded across the neighborhood declaring my house officially abandoned, the orange sticker screaming like a warning sign to every passerby. She truly believed her word was law. But what she didn't know was that I had already prepared the footage, the very evidence that would unravel everything she'd built. So let me ask you, asterisk if your enemies were this bold, would you strike back quietly in the shadows, or would you expose them in front of everyone? The night before the HOA scheduled board meeting, I stayed up for hours reviewing my evidence one final time. Every clip, every angle, every trespassing step. Karen sneaking onto my porch. The contractor circling my home like a vulture. The volunteer rattling doorknobs under the cover of darkness. And the damning piece. The board members lifting my grass to make it look taller for their photos. Proof not just of harassment, but of fabrication. The next day, the neighborhood gathered in the community center. Board meetings were usually dull affairs. Arguments about landscaping, complaints about trash bins. But this one had drawn a crowd. The rumors about my house had spread far and wide. Some were curious, others judgmental, but all came to see what the abandoned property fuss was about. Karen stood tall at the front of the room, clutching her clipboard like a badge of honor. Her voice carried with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. She spoke confidently, declaring my property a blight, an eyesore, an abandonment that the board had the right to seize under emergency enforcement measures. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably as she laid out her fabricated case, waving photos that had been carefully staged. But then, when she demanded the board approval to proceed with reassignment, I stood up. All eyes turned toward me. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The man whose house had supposedly been abandoned was very much present, alive, and ready to fight back. I didn't speak. Instead, I reached into my bag and placed a small projector on the table. The screen flickered to life. Silence swept the room. The first clip played, Karen and her committee sneaking across my lawn, laughing, tugging at the grass to make it appear overgrown. Murmurs filled the air. Another clip. Karen pressing her face against my window, shielding her eyes as she peered into my home. Gasps. And then the darkest footage. The enforcement volunteer creeping along my walls at midnight, flashlight in hand, tested my doors like a burglar. The room erupted. Neighbors shouted, pointed, whispered furiously to one another. The illusion of abandonment crumbled in seconds. And Karen, who had stood so confidently minutes earlier, went pale. Her power, built on intimidation and lies, was slipping through her fingers. I let the clips roll one by one, each one matched with a violation letter it disproved. I didn't need to explain. The footage spoke louder than any words. And by the time it ended, the board's credibility lay in ruins. But Karen wasn't ready to surrender. She slammed her clipboard on the table, her voice trembling with rage. She accused me of manipulating the footage, of spying illegally, of violating community privacy laws. She shouted so loudly her words cracked. But it was too late. Neighbors who had once been afraid of her stood up. Some demanded her resignation on the spot. Others muttered about calling the police. And one by one, her supporters melted away, unwilling to defend her in the face of undeniable proof. I didn't have to call law enforcement, because someone else already had. Midway through the chaos, 2 uniformed officers entered the room. They had been sent in response to my earlier report, armed with copies of the footage I had provided in advance. When they announced that they would be investigating the HOA for harassment, trespassing, and unlawful entry attempts, Karen's fury turned to panic. She tried to talk her way out, blaming the volunteer for the nighttime prowling, claiming the contractor visit was routine maintenance, insisting the board acted in the community's best interest. But her words rang hollow. The evidence was too clear, too damning. Within minutes, the board voted to suspend her pending investigation. The power she had clung to so desperately was stripped from her in front of the very people she once controlled. And as the officers escorted her out, the once feared HOA president, who had tried to brand my house abandoned, who had schemed to claim my home as her own, looked smaller than ever. Her reign was over. The aftermath was slow but steady. The board restructured, new elections were called, and several members resigned rather than face the backlash. Neighbors who had believed the lies apologized quietly, some even offering help with repairs or yard work as a way to make amends. My house was never truly abandoned, but for a time, it felt like my home was under siege, not from strangers, but from the very people meant to protect the neighborhood. The cameras didn't just save my house. They revealed the truth, uncovered corruption, and exposed what happens when power goes unchecked in an HOA. And that's why I ask you, if your community leaders ever try to strip away your rights, would you be ready to fight back? If you found this story shocking, don't forget, this happens more often than people realize. HOAs, Karens, and neighborhood power struggles can turn ordinary lives into nightmares. If you want more unbelievable true stories just like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and ring the bell so you never miss what's coming next. And tell me in the comments, *, what would you do if your HOA declared your home abandoned while you were away?